At that time, Europeans were still living very simply. They farmed together and grew only what they needed. Individual ownership or achievement was not part of their culture. When they died, they joined their ancestors in the communal burial chamber. But then, a new, mysterious culture appeared across Europe, with a very different kind of grave.
200 or 300 years ago, when archaeologists first began to excavate some of the round burial mounds that are to be found in places like England or Scotland or Scandinavia, they discovered a very characteristic set of grave goods. There would be a body which was buried individually, unlike the collective megalithic stone tombs that had preceded them. These burial mounds had people interred as individuals with all the bones articulated and in place. And they were buried with their own personal equipment. They were buried, for example, with a drinking cup and with their fighting equipment. These graves were called, after their contents, the graves of the Beaker folk.
The Beaker people were the traders of Stone Age Europe. Using pack horses, they brought a new set of ideas and precious objects that turned the place upside down.
They were able to trade, they were able to organize supplies of things. Very small quantities, we're not talking about bulk trade, but items that were very precious and were considered highly desirable and were traded over long distances and gave these people an entry into a wide range of other societies. The drinking cups perhaps suggest that there were new things to be drunk, and it's a very plausible suggestion that what we're looking at is the first use of fermentation to make alcoholic drinks. This is a very handsome example of one of these beakers, a relatively early one, and you can see what it is. It's a tall drinking cup that would have held a considerable quantity of liquid. So you can imagine them being used rather like this, held in two hands, and possibly passed around between the participants of a drinking ceremony.
The drinking cups suggest that there were new things to be drunk. They made an early form of mead using honey for drinking rituals.
Fermentation was one of the ways of showing off your elite status, along with having your elite weaponry traded over long distances. So they're all different ways of showing how you have access to things that other people can't get. And what we're really looking at is people who are rich enough to have sources of sugar to provide fermented drinks. So this is both a drinking vessel and also a symbol of power, a real symbol of wealth and the ability to mobilize these rare, sweet substances which can be fermented into something even more precious, that is the intoxicating substance, alcohol.
The Beaker people brought the spirit of change that shook the staid old Stone Age life. They believed much more in the value of the individual. They came as traders and stayed to farm, building their own characteristic villages. What's more, they brought the art of smelting to the north. They added a vital secret from the Middle Eastern trading routes. Mix some tin to copper, and you get bronze. This process was so important, the Smiths had the richest graves. They were probably clan chiefs.
The beginning of the Bronze Age, you can imagine that much of the metalworking was actually undertaken by the chiefs themselves. And we now see this as a rather sort of banal task that should be undertaken by workmen or craftsmen, by sort of lower status people. But if you think of it as the magical transformation of one thing into another, then it's another way of showing off and demonstrating your power and your status and securing your role in society. And so it's therefore very characteristic that you find the moulds in rich graves, in the graves of the chiefs. So the people who are in charge of society are in charge of the transformation of oars into flashing daggers and weaponry. The Bronze Age consists in the introduction of edge weapons that you couldn't make effectively in stone, daggers that increasingly get longer and longer and become swords, spearheads that can be really effectively fixed on the end of a long pole. So the whole nature of armament was transformed by the introduction of a really effective working metal, bronze.
These weapons exude power. They are rare and dangerous. We are seeing the birth of a military elite with the power to get exactly what they want. Yet the weapons rarely show signs of use. Perhaps they were purely ceremonial. These leaders wore breastplates and decorative metal jewelry, again as symbols of their wealth. And they had another power symbol, the mounted horse. The pack animal was now being ridden. The owners towered over everyone else. They could move fast and cover huge distances. Horses were expensive to keep. A single horse eats more than a family. Only the elite could afford to keep them. This accumulation of symbols suggests they were preoccupied with power. They were developing a new kind of society with leaders and followers. The leaders dominated community life. Most farmers who produced life's basic necessities were the followers. This new social dynamic created its own momentum for change. With their new wealth, the elite families could support specialized crafts. They used materials like wood in more complex ways. And they learned how to use the most imaginative innovation of all, the wheel.
Well, archaeologists are always being asked when was the wheel invented, and we can now give a rather precise answer that it was about 5,500 years ago that it spread. And these are very simple, solid wooden wheels, often turning along with the axle that must have made an amazing creaking sound as it moved slowly through the streets. So this is not a speed vehicle, but it is the first wheeled vehicle ever seen.
Like bronze, this invention came from the Middle East. In a muddy landscape without roads, it transformed the movement of large loads. Trade was beginning to move from Europe back to the Middle East. It started from the seaweed on the beach of the Baltic Sea. It contained the one thing that came from nowhere else and would go as far as Egypt.
In the Bronze Age, you have the first example of a material that travelled all the way from one sea to the other. It must have been precious, it must have been lightweight, it must have been precious in relation to its weight. And indeed it was. That substance is amber.